Staying on China, tension not just in the Pacific but also between the world's two superpowers after President Joe Biden abandoned decades of US policy by confirming he'll intervene militarily if China invades Taiwan. Joining us now to talk about that is ITV's Asia correspondent Debi Edward, live from Beijing. Debi, tēnā, thank you for joining us. When President Biden said the US would come to Taiwan's defence, how did China react to that?
Well, I think this is the third time that President Biden has made what has been described previously as a gaffe, but when you have said it three times, it does start to look a bit consistent and look like the US does have a new foreign policy. Of course, his comments were immediately walked back by his White House advisors, but they were already out there and, of course, now being taken as read by China, who have described the US as a bully with a Cold War mentality. And relations between the US and China are already at their lowest ebb in 40 years. The Biden administration very much picking up from Trump with their more hawkish approach to China. And in fact, President Biden describing China as its biggest strategic challenge, its biggest foreign policy challenge. So all of that language between the two nations, a relationship that's described as the most consequential of the 21st century, does really have an impact on global relations. And China has already started to talk about US intentions in the region, in the Asia region. Of course, we saw President Biden here in Asia, and he didn't come here to Beijing, come here to China. The first time that a US president in 20 years hasn't come to China as part of their Asia tour. President Trump came here first, put China at the centerpiece of his Asia tour, but President Biden chose not to come, and that is only just fermenting poor relations between the two nations. And China now talking about the fact that the US is trying to ferment these allies in the region and talking about an Asia NATO. And of course, we know that it was the expansion of NATO that prompted Russia to invade Ukraine. We don't know what China's tipping point is on Taiwan, but President Biden is treading a very fine line between deterrence and provocation.
Debi, let's talk about the Chinese economic forecast, which is very grim at the moment and the first time in decades. Can China afford a confrontation with the West?
It can. I think we are at this inflection point where China is weighing up its relations with the West and how much it can afford to cut those off. For the first time, we're talking about a potential contraction in the Chinese economy. The forecasts are very grim. And at Davos this week at the World Economic Forum, there were warnings that the supply chain difficulties that we're seeing prompted by this zero COVID policy, about all these lockdowns in Shanghai that we're seeing at the moment, could cause global inflation to skyrocket and could prompt a global depression. Of course, China is intrinsically linked. It's closely connected to the whole global economy. But of course, from China, it would say that the US wouldn't go as far as decoupling. The West wouldn't go as far as decoupling from the Chinese economy because they'd only be shooting themselves in the foot.
Let's talk about the zero COVID strategy that China has adopted and has implemented at an enormous cost. And now cases are picking up in Beijing. Could the capital lock down, Debi?
We hope not. Every day it seems like the walls are closing in, but it is doing everything it can to avoid those scenes we have seen in Shanghai where they're entering almost their third month of a lockdown. And it is those. Because it is the capital, it is the seat of government, and this has been the most protected city since the beginning of this outbreak, and they're doing everything they can to save face and not have this major lockdown in the city. But that's not to say that we're not almost in lockdown here. We're working from home. The restaurants are closed. Even to go along a walk on the river behind me, you have to scan a health code and show a COVID test result within 48 hours. But at the moment, the numbers do seem to be coming down here. But this government is insisting on sticking to this method, which has been successful for the past 2 years since that initial outbreak in Wuhan. They've dealt with every flare-up with these lockdowns lockdowns, with mass testing. But as these more transmissible variants, the Omicron variant has appeared, it just doesn't seem to be working anymore. They are losing control of these outbreaks quite quickly. And now, as we just talked about, it's having a hugely detrimental impact on the economy. But the problem that they have is that they have stuck to it for these past 2 years. They've tied it almost to their political agenda. The president himself has doubled down on it as a success story of an authoritarian political system. So there's no going back on this system. And in fact, in recent days here in Beijing, we've started to see the mobile popping up, the mobile test sites at the entrances to subway stations. So it looks like this policy is very much here to stay.
Debi, further information leaked this week from Xinjiang about treatment of the Uyghurs in detention camps. It's been a big story internationally, but what about inside China? What's it like there?
Well, of course, it is very difficult to talk about this as a subject. They have been increasingly holding these press conferences for us to try and tell us the truth, as they call it, about Xinjiang, which they say is a happy and harmonious province in China. They say we are open to travel there and see for ourselves. But when we have gone there, we have found it very difficult to get people to talk to us. We have been trailed by local officials, by local police who have told us that we are not allowed to go into certain places, and they make it extremely difficult. At the moment, we do have the UN High Commissioner in the country. Finally, the UN has been allowed into the country to see for themselves what is going on, but that is a hugely chaperoned visit. She also will not be allowed to independently talk to anyone that she sees fit, and anyone that does talk to her will have been briefed beforehand and will be debriefed afterwards to make sure that they didn't divert from a script. But those files that you're talking about did come out on the eve of her arrival here in China, and of course she will have been able to present those to the Chinese authorities and question them directly. So although this visit is going to be very stage managed, it is going to be a bit of theatre, she will be able to be here on the ground and look in the eyes of the Chinese officials and ask them the questions that need to be asked about Xinjiang, about the persecution of the Uyghur people.
Appreciate that insight and your time, Debi. Debi Edward live there from Beijing. So what does our panel make of all that? Georgie Stylian